Hello, my name is Kathleen Murphy-Hollies. I'm a PhD student at the University of Birmingham, and this is my talk on when hybrid accounts of disorder are not enough, looking at the case of gender dysphoria. Some of my key claims: I argue that a hybrid account of disorder, such as Wakefield, does not accurately identify the multiple dysfunctions and harms which are implicated in gender dysphoria. This means that patients with very different clinical symptoms often get muddled together and get lumped together under one diagnosis. Closer inspection for that, and particularly an engagement with more sociological concepts such as gender and oppression, become relevant to whether gender dysphoria should be classed as a mental disorder. As a side note, I'm assuming that the aim of the DSM is to catalogue disorders, so if something's in the DSM, it's a disorder. You might still want to provide medical treatment to conditions which are not technically disorders, but if it's in the DSM, it's a disorder. So Wakefield's hybrid account brings together a factual value-free component and a culturally determined value-laden component. The first is a requirement of a dysfunction in a mental mechanism, so it's no longer carrying out its natural function. The natural function of the heart, for example, is to pump blood, so if something happens that the heart can't pump blood anymore, then there's a dysfunction there. But also because many of us will have some degree of dysfunction in a lot of our processes, but they're harmless, and because we might not even know that we have them, there's also a harm requirement. So we apply cultural values of harm and societal expectations of what is a good quality of life to ascertain whether that condition is bringing harm. The hope is that bringing together a normative and a naturalist component of mental disorder avoids pathologizing expectable, normal or healthy mental states. For example, homosexuality was in the past classed as a mental disorder and was in the DSM, but today we recognise that there's no disorder there. By specifying that the harm experienced, in this case just the harm of experiencing a homophobic society, should be tied to or due to a biological dysfunction within the individual, we avoid classifying homosexuality as a mental disorder just because it's socially disvalued. So I just want to mention gender identity disorder, which is in the DSM-4 and is a predecessor to gender dysphoria in the DSM-5 because Wakefield says some things about it. These are the diagnostic criteria. I've put them all on so you can pause the video to have a proper look at them, but they relate to insisting that you are the other sex, preferring the clothes and games of the opposite sex, discomfort with your sex, and a sense of inappropriateness in your gender role. This became gender dysphoria in the DSM-5, and the criteria is split across those for children and those for adolescents and adults. For children, the criteria relate to a desire to be the other gender, preference for clothes, roles and games associated with the other gender, and a discomfort with your sexual anatomy. For adolescents and adults, similarly, symptoms relate to an incongruence between your experienced gender and your assigned gender, wanting different sex characteristics, wanting to be and be treated as the opposite gender. So when it comes to whether a hybrid account would identify gender dysphoria as a disorder, in a 2012 paper, Wakefield said that because the DSM-4 says that gender identity disorder must not merely be a desire for the perceived cultural advantages of being the other sex, it therefore avoids pathologizing a normal mental state just because it's socially disvalued. This same exact statement isn't in the criteria for gender dysphoria in the DSM-5, but in the DSM-5's definition of mental disorder, it does say that conflicts that are primarily between the individual and the society are not mental disorders. So I take it that what Wakefield says about gender identity disorder would follow over, and he wouldn't think that gender dysphoria and the DSM-5 is a false positive for mental disorder either. We seem to have harm. A 2015 US transgender survey found that 39% of transgender individuals reported serious psychological distress. 40% had attempted suicide, 30% had experienced homelessness, 29% were living in poverty, and a higher proportion were unemployed. This suggests that it does lead to impaired functioning. It's also intensely distressing to feel wrongly embodied to the extent that it motivates getting risky and expensive surgery and even self-surgery. When it comes to dysfunction, in a 2003 paper, Wakefield claimed that gender identity disorder is a disorder which clearly corresponds to a type of inferred design mechanism that has gone wrong, even if we don't know the intricacies of that mechanism of gender development. So in all, I think that when we apply a hybrid account of disorder to gender dysphoria, it would identify it as a mental disorder. A problem here, which Wakefield's hybrid account isn't really extensive enough to identify, is that there's an overlap of two really quite different clinical groups in the diagnostic criteria for gender dysphoria. These are those who have gender role dysphoria, which is a discomfort with aspects of having a certain gender in society, such as its associated stereotypes, hobbies, or dress, and so on, versus having sex dysphoria, which is an intense discomfort with your physical sexed characteristics. So this could be your genitals or your breasts, for example. If we have another look at the criteria for gender dysphoria for children, note that you could have these 6 criteria in red and have no sex dysphoria whatsoever. In adolescents and adults, you could have these 2 criteria at the bottom, which also have nothing to do with body or sex dysphoria. Or you could have these, which are purely to do with having sex dysphoria. I think having these 2 really different clinical groups together in the one diagnosis makes it really complicated and difficult to identify the harm and the dysfunction going on with the condition. When it comes to a dysfunction, I think it's easier to see in the case of sex dysphoria what kind of mechanism might have a dysfunction going on. Perhaps a mental mechanism for conceptualizing your body constitution, something which isn't entirely unlike body dysmorphic disorder, but it relates specifically to sex characteristics. It's also clear, I think, that the distress there is tied to the dysfunction. So if people with sex dysphoria were taken away from society, they wouldn't necessarily return to normal functioning, and we wouldn't want to stop saying that they have a disorder. But it's not clear what the relation is between this kind of dysfunction and another dysfunction, or the experience of gender role dysphoria. The dysfunction underlying gender role dysphoria is harder to see, and I'll return to why in the next slide. When it comes to harm, the hybrid theory of disorder does not ask why something which it identifies as a harm is experienced as a harm. It impedes functioning, and it means that you don't live up to cultural standards of a good quality of life. But why? There might be better or worse reasons for that. It might fail because it's a good cultural standard for a good quality of life, and the condition in question means that you just can't meet it. Or it might be that society is prejudiced and limits your quality of life when you have that condition. And I think this question is really important when it comes to gender dysphoria. Why sex dysphoria is so harmful feels easier to answer. It's clearly very distressing and distracting to feel like parts of your body are wrong and maybe shouldn't be there. But it's not so clear with gender role dysphoria. When you reject gender stereotypes and prefer other ones, why is that a harm? So as I mentioned in the previous slide, I think this issue of what dysfunction could underlie gender role dysphoria actually brings us to the issue of how gender is supposed to be understood in that diagnostic criteria. There are 2 possible ways or accounts of gender. The first is an identity-based view of gender, and this understands gender to be kind of part of someone's identity, and that identity then in turn tells them which gender stereotypes are appropriate for them. So the identity precedes the gender stereotypes. This is probably the understanding of gender which is meant to be used in the DSM, because it's the only one which makes sense with criteria such as an insistence that one is the other gender. And with that understanding of gender, it appears to be self-generated, and then clothes and pastimes, even certain feelings and reactions, are expressions of that identity. But this isn't particularly defended or justified, and it's not clear how really it links to sex dysphoria. This leads some, such as Lawrence, to suggest that people with sex dysphoria, as a result of having sex dysphoria, can end up developing a new gender identity to match their preferred sex characteristics, and that therefore gender role dysphoria should be seen as an epiphenomenon to sex dysphoria. There's another perfectly possible understanding of gender, which is a more traditional view of gender, which sees it as a sort of very pervasive set of expectations which are projected onto people in society, with their sex determining which expectations are applied to them. So they're much more preferential for men and they're much more oppressive for women. And being subject to these kinds of expectations means that the gender stereotypes precede gender. Those that are applied to you make your gender. It's not self-generated, it's something that's applied. Which of these understandings of gender we adopt affect what dysfunctions and harms we identify? According to the traditional view of gender, a dysfunction in what gender is applied to you doesn't make sense. The dysfunction in identity-based view of gender is not clear at all, and it's harder to find out when it's muddled in with such different symptoms. Similarly, what harm we are identifying is affected by which account of gender we adopt. According to an identity-based view of gender, perhaps you could say that the gender binary is insufficient. But according to a traditional notion of gender, if we accept that the gender for women, or the gender stereotypes for women are inherently harmful, then it would be expectable for women to reject those stereotypes, to seek more highly valued ones, and to be treated as the opposite sex, and so on. And we do see that women are overrepresented at the moment at gender clinics. That's from this Cretella paper. It doesn't seem right to pathologise women or men who reject harmful gender stereotypes, and it might even be exactly the kind of thing that we were hoping to avoid when we adopted a hybrid account of disorder. I think one of the reasons that we were sort of primed not to recognise that it's not clear what the link is between sex dysphoria and gender role dysphoria is just how pervasive and ubiquitous gendered expectations are in society, that we associate them so closely with the relevant sex that we don't wonder why one dysfunction should explain them both. If we take the traditional view of gender, that gender stereotypes are inherently harmful, and then we see them in the criteria for gender dysphoria, like hallmarks of a different gender identity, you might think that if these individuals were removed from society and away from those harmful gender stereotypes, they might not still be distressed, and we might not still want to say that they have a disorder. But in fact, the criteria wouldn't even be intelligible because they refer specifically to those gender stereotypes. But this is what we wanted to avoid by tying the harm to a dysfunction, so that socially disvalued states are not pathologised. States which, if they were removed from a prejudiced society, we would stop wanting to say that they were disorders. I don't even necessarily need to endorse one of these accounts of gender. The fact is that one of them means that we are pathologising a mental state, and the other means that we aren't. So this matter of how gender should be understood has become relevant to whether we are accurately identifying a mental disorder. This is what Wakefield wanted to be able to do, to identify disorder and avoid pathologising normal states, when he brought together a normative and a naturalistic element to an account of mental disorder. But here it is seen not to be enough by itself to do that satisfactorily. We also see the extent to which a successful account of mental disorder will need to engage with more sociological concepts, such as what groups are in society, what a gender is, how gender depression works, to be able to define disorder. So to round up, when it comes to analysing harm, this issue is kind of better known or recognised when it comes to purely normative accounts of mental disorder, that focusing on harm can mean that normal states are pathologised just because they're socially valued, and that's what brings harm. And here, in the case of gender dysphoria, I don't think just adding a naturalist element has managed to solve that issue. I also suggest that how ubiquitous and pervasive gender stereotypes are in society might be why we don't immediately see that the link between gender role dysphoria and sex dysphoria isn't obvious. Why should a discomfort with such different things, one being gender roles and one being sex characteristics, be traced to one dysfunction and both be included in one diagnosis? It is very surprising when you see individuals reject expected stereotypes so fiercely, but whether it's a mental disorder isn't clear, and we would probably hesitate to call that a mental disorder. Sex dysphoria alone, on the other hand, does seem more straightforwardly to be a mental disorder and not a normal state, which is just subject to a prejudiced society, and that's what's causing harm. So which account of gender we accept determines whether we are pathologising a healthy group or not, but Wakefield's hybrid account isn't extensive enough to accommodate for this kind of thing. If we take a traditional view of gender, with gender being inherently harmful, this already explains why patients suffer distress. And then we risk enforcing those gender stereotypes as natural hallmarks of the genders of men and women when we pathologise people who do not conform to them. And so an account of disorder will actually have to engage with sociological concepts such as groups and how oppression occurs in order to be able to define mental disorder in a way which makes sure that it does not pathologise people with normal but just socially disvalued mental states. Thank you for listening.